is not blue.
Today we're going to talk about Cormac McCarthy's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Road. In particular, we're going to discuss the novel's rejection of the past and Cormac McCarthy's portrayal of women in a post-apocalyptic future. But first, let's take a look at a few other examples of post-apocalyptic fiction to determine whether or not Cormac McCarthy's novel is actually unique among the genre. One of the important aspects of any post-apocalyptic fiction is spectacle. Every iteration has one. It serves either to A, develop the characters like Mad Max, or B, to counter the depressing nature of the circumstances that the characters are in, and to keep the audience engaged. The spectacle in McCarthy's novel is the Faulkner-esque style of writing. The flowery prose keeps the audience engaged throughout all of the horrible and terrible circumstances the characters find themselves in. But as I've shown you, there's a film adaptation of The Road. So how do they translate the spectacle of prose into a spectacle for the screen? And the answer to that is Nick Cave and Warren Ellis. The score for The Road is primarily piano and violin driven, which is incongruous to the events that are occurring on the screen. And this is actually counter to most modern post-apocalyptic films. The music in most apocalyptic films, as with the Book of Eli, is generally to counter the spectacle and to make sure that the audience doesn't disengage too much from the depressing and horrific nature of this post-apocalyptic world. Max avoids and purposefully counters archetypical depictions of sexuality. But having these types of villains is sort of analogous to how we view our ancient ancestors, or to how we view barbarians in general. And the audience tends to expect that when everything collapses, people will resort to barbarism. Let's talk about how The Road handles these themes. McCarthy's novel seems to have a disconnect, or better yet, a rejection of the past. As we've seen that Mad Max simply disregards the past, The Road is violent in its severing from history. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards, Soren Kierkegaard. But if life can only be understood backwards, like Kierkegaard says, then what does this mean for The Road? Well, I think it means that the morality that the father and son exhibit becomes canonical, or religious. But there's also some interesting things to be said about how the father handles morality. The father seems to be okay, at least in most respects, with killing if it's out of necessity, or more specifically for protection, but never cannibalism. In fact, there's a mantra in the book: don't eat people. We don't eat people. But if the old world is gone, then why avoid eating people? Why avoid eating the baby on the pike? Well, this is where religion comes into play, and the rejection of the past then becomes canonical in sort of a weird way. There's a part where the father is looking out over the barren landscape and he describes it as godless, but the next paragraph is crucial, because the next paragraph counters that entire sentiment.
Sometimes I tell the boy old stories of courage and justice, difficult as they are to remember. All I know is the child is my warrant. And if he is not the Word of God, then God never spoke.
In that clip, which is practically verbatim from the book, the son is described as his warrant. Now, this is important because the use of the word warrant dictates an imperative, and this imperative is described by God. Later on in the book, when the son is questioning whether or not they're the good guys, the father says, "You wanted to know what the bad guys looked like. Now you know. It may happen again. My job is to take care of you. I was appointed by God. I will kill anyone who touches you. Do you understand?" Yes. He sat there, cowled in the blanket. After a while, he looked up. "Are we still the good guys?" he said. "Yes, we're still the good guys. And we always will be." "Yes, we always will be." Okay. But why this dichotomy? Why the godless, barren landscape, but the religious iconography of the father and son? I think the answer is survival.
A man who reduced to a single instinct. Survive.
But I don't think this theme of survival extends only to the characters like the father, the son, or even Max Rokitansky. I think post-apocalyptic fiction places minimal figures of morality inside situations with amplified carnal instincts in order to see if humanity can survive in a sea of chaos. Then it becomes more about our concept of humanity surviving in this wasteland as a whole rather than the individual characters, and we as the audience are able to connect with that. Now we're going to talk about the portrayal of women in McCarthy's post-apocalyptic world. But first we're going to take just a few seconds to talk about the portrayal of women in other post-apocalyptic fiction. In post-apocalyptic fiction in general, we can often see women portrayed as commodities, and most often they're physical or sexual or erotic commodities. Now, whether or not you see this as indicative of what would happen because you believe in inherent barbarism, meaning you think when society collapses that humans will instinctively resort to their most base and cruel instincts. And while on a base level, it's easy to attribute these facets to the women portrayed in The Road, I don't think that's quite an easy enough answer. And as I've mentioned before, there's already another outlier in Mad Max in regards to its portrayal of sexuality, women, and relationships as a whole. And the new one will no doubt explore this in further detail.
We are not things. We are not things.
But here we're going to talk about 3 specific moments in the book, 2 of which are intertwined. Now I'm going to read you 2 passages and then we're going to discuss them, and the third one's about the mother who is not quite treated the same as the rest of the women in the novel. So let's begin with the passages. This passage is in regards to the father and son hiding from a passing convoy. They clanked past, marching with a swaying gait like wound-up toys, bearded, their breath smoking through their masks. "Shh," he said. "Shh." The phalanx following carried spears or lances tasseled with ribbons, the long blades hammered out of truck springs in some crude forge-up country. The boy lay with his face in his arms, terrified. They passed 200 feet away, the ground shuddering lightly, tramping. Behind them came wagons drawn by slaves and harnessed and piled with goods of war, and after that the women, perhaps a dozen in number, some of them pregnant, and lastly a supplementary consort of catamites, ill-clothed against the cold and fitted in dog collars and yoked to each other. All passed on. They lay, listening. Before we address this passage, I'm going to read you the one that this is intertwined with in our discussion. The father and the son have just scared away a band of 3. They walked into the little clearing, the boy clutching his hand. They'd taken everything with them except whatever black thing was skewered over the coals. He was standing there, checking the perimeter, when the boy turned and buried his face against him. He looked quickly to see what had happened. "What is it?" he said. "What is it?" The boy shook his head. "Oh, Papa," he said. He turned and looked again. What the boy had seen was a charred human infant, headless and gutted and blackening on the spit. He bent and picked up the boy and started for the road with him, holding him close. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry." In this portrayal, the women aren't slaves per se, as in sex toys or things like that, though I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It does. But here, the perception is not that. In this world, in The Road, the world is devoid of plant life, of animal life. But how do these 2 passages connect? What does this mean for the women who are chained to the convoy and for the baby on the pike? Well, we are safe to assume that the people that we see outside of the father and son are cannibals. The father and son continually chant the mantra, "We don't eat people. We're the good guys. Good guys don't eat people." And every other person we run into has committed some form, or is assumed to have committed some form of cannibalism. As the book endeavors to explain to you, this is out of necessity. There's no food, no wildlife, and you struggle to find anything canned or still edible. So in this essence, in connecting the 2 passages, we can make the assumption that the women who are chained to the convoy are crops for creating food. And this is incredibly inhuman, and it's wrong. But does this make McCarthy, as the author, misogynistic? But that kind of depends on each individual in the audience's own worldview. If you believe in the inherent barbarism that I mentioned earlier, then yes, you probably believe that this would happen. But the argument I would like to make is that McCarthy is in fact not misogynistic. I think that the portrayal of women reflects the portrayal of anyone with less power in this universe. And power is sort of a tricky, fickle thing in this world, because power seems to be doled out to whoever can do the most damage to the others. But there's a third passage that I want to read to you that I think sort of liberates McCarthy from this generalization that he's misogynistic for depicting this sort of worldview that you, in fact, yourself as the audience would probably attribute yourself. This particular scene is one of the earliest in this universe's timeline, and it's a conversation between the father and the mother. And I'm going to read you this right now, and we'll talk about it right after I read it. "We used to talk about death," she said. "We don't anymore." "Why is that?" "I don't know. It's because it's here. There's nothing left to talk about. I wouldn't leave you. I don't care. It's meaningless. You can think of me as a faithless slut if you like. I've taken a new lover. He can give me what you cannot. Death is not a lover. Oh, yes, he is. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I can't do it alone." "Then I don't. I can't help you." They say that women dream of danger to those in their care and men of danger to themselves. But I don't dream at all. You say you can't? Then don't do it. That's all. As for me, my only hope is for eternal nothingness, and I hope it with all my heart. He didn't answer. You have no argument because there is none. She was gone, and the coldness of it was her final gift. McCarthy is doing something really interesting here. The romancing of death is sort of counter folklore. In a lot of folk stories, when death appears as a personification, people try to reason, gamble, or bargain with death in order to stave it away. But here, romancing death is not to push death away, it's to embrace it. Suicide in pop culture is usually depicted in one of two ways, as altruism or as a facet of power. Which do I think that the mother's is? I think it's power. Why do I think it's power? Because the father is a Catholic figure by his continual references to God as mentioned before. Suicide is objectively a sin which violates the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." The mother's romancing of death and subsequent suicide challenges holding on to these sort of old world moralities. And it's a powerful message to the futility of what will become the father's imperative. In conclusion, I think The Road is a powerful and well-composed book about the survival of morality in a dead world. The rejection of the past serves to highlight its futility. What only matters is the present and how the future is affected. Outside of the mother, I think that women in the novel are treated as crops to further distance the father and the son from cannibalism, and to retain the mantra that keeps them the good guys. Don't eat people. Don't eat people. Thanks a lot for watching.
The clock stopped at 1:17. There was a long sheer of bright light, then a series of low concussions.